Hey guys, this is both an analysis and an experiment. We've been following all the fallout from Patreon banning Sargon of Akkad. We've obviously been using Patreon to fund ourselves, so we found ourselves in a bit of a bind like many creators. We are going to have a little interview with Sargon in this. We're going to upload it onto Patreon to see, because the problem is no one knows what the rules are. Lots of patrons have already left, some creators have left. Jordan Peterson and Dave Rubin have lost around 20% of their patrons. They're in the process of creating an alternative to Patreon. We've not lost so many, but we have lost some, and many others have asked us what we're going to do, and we're going to tell you at the end of this film. So Sargon was kicked off Patreon for using language that Patreon considered racist and homophobic. But the relevant content wasn't even on Patreon itself, despite them being clear that their terms of service only applied to content on the platform. What I'm going to do in this film is try and look at the whole situation. We're even going to play the offending clip with the relevant words bleeped out and upload this film onto Patreon itself. So as a journalist, I'm going to try and apply the most rigorous editorial guidelines I know to cover this content that patrons already said is unacceptable. The key point that I'm going to try and make is that editorial policy is always about context. This is something I learned over about 15 years of working at Channel 4 and the BBC. Everything always has a context. There are no absolutes in any media organisation that I'm aware of. Everything is dependent on the situation and the context. I'm going to interview Sargon to give him his right of reply, to put the context, and I've also approached Patreon to get their right of reply as well. So context is everything in terms of making any editorial decision, and so I'm going to also lay out why we're doing what we're doing, because we're also going to play the clip where Sargon uses the language that got him kicked off Patreon. Why? Because you can't make sense of this story without that clip. So you have to justify, okay, why are you playing that clip? Is it editorially justified? And the argument is always about context, and the context in this is, one, you can't make sense of the story without it. Two, this is extremely significant. Why is it significant? Because a lot of us feel that there is some kind of... why is it significant? Because a lot of us feel that this is going to ramp up in the run-up to 2020. All of the social media platforms and the tech companies are going to be doing more and more and more to make sure that they can't be accused of getting Trump re-elected, for example. And I think they were hugely shocked by a lot of the allegations about fake news and them being complicit in Trump being elected in 2016. And they are determined to do everything that they can to avoid that happening again. And I think a lot of us are very worried that this means they're going to overreach hugely and end up restricting everything to a very small number of agreed topics and agreed subjects.
Yeah, and it raises an interesting question, and also another aspect of the experiment we're running, in a sense, which is this idea of guilt by association, which was kind of implicit in the alternative influencers network map that came out a few months ago, of which Sargon was kind of bang in the middle. The assumption is, and Vox have put out articles against even like PewDiePie, accusing him of being a neo-Nazi sympathizer because he mentioned a channel that in its archives had some material that was, it's just kind of exactly what it is. It's a web of association that is used to imply guilt. So that's an interesting question. Are we, in a sense, guilty for hosting Sargon on our channel? Does that put us in this web of, guilt? What I find disturbing about that, the assumption behind it, is it's been very common, or it's been a very common tactic in a lot of authoritarian societies and cultures. It was classic in Stasi Germany that if you wanted your neighbor's apartment, all you had to do was go to the Stasi in East Germany and just say, hey, I saw them associating with some weird artsy jazz playing types. Just saying, don't know what that means, just saying. That was all it was, an association was one of the tactics that really destroyed your reputation. And that tactic is being played out again. So again, there's got to be some boundary to the association. There's got to be some kind of conversation around it, rather than just the rote assumption of guilt by association.
The editorial judgment is the way that he says it, the tone, the context, all affects it. I don't think it's necessary to play the words themselves. I think bleeping it out is the right thing to do. Interestingly, Sargon did that himself on his own channel. When he played the clip, he bleeped the the words.
This is what I mean about the chat. I just can't be bothered to deal with people who treat me like this. It's really annoying. Like you are acting like a bunch of niggas. Just so you know, you act like white niggas. Exactly how you describe black people acting is the impression I get dealing with the alt-right.
So Patreon say that you were banned from the site for using homophobic and racist language, and they're right, aren't they?
I don't really agree. I think that the language is not objectively homophobic or racist. I believe it's dependent on the context in which you're using it. The context in this question is me calling some Nazis the N-word, which I guess when you say it like that, on the face of it, it's kind of head-scratching. It's like, okay, wait, how does this go? But that's the point. The entire reason that I did that is I was being harassed by them for many months, and it was frankly coming to the end of my tether. And I thought I'd just tell them what I think about them. And the way that they denigrate others is the way in which themselves they behave. So that's what I was using against them when I said that.
And I've listened to the quote, of course. Do you accept that you were quite incautious with your language?
Yes. Well, like I said, I was at the end of my tether. You know, at that point, I didn't really care. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to, you know, you're just terrible people. And, you know, you've got to stop acting like terrible people. That's what I was trying to put across. But I very much agree. It was very incautious. But to be honest with you, I'm an anti-political correctness crusader. You know, if someone can say that's offensive, then that's okay. People can be offended. They'll get over it.
And if Patreon had said, we've discovered this, we're going to give you a warning, how would you have responded to that?
I think that would have been far more reasonable than what they did. And I would have apologized and said, okay, warning received, understood, you know. And I think that a reasonable interpretation of their terms and conditions, as their CEO has given, demonstrate that that's what they would be complaining about isn't something that is listed in the terms and conditions. So it would have been surprising, and I think it would have been appropriate to have said, look, we don't like this and we'd really appreciate if you'd stop it. And I would have done, you know, I would have actually taken that on board, because ultimately political purge of, I mean, I guess what they would call right-wing figures, but I think that's because of the extremely far-left political nature of not just Patreon, but Silicon Valley itself. And I'm a centrist, and every time I do any kind of political test, I always come out very, very, very center libertarian. So I think that just goes to show how much tighter the noose has become of late. And I think that's because of a few recent additions to their trust and safety team. The culture of it seems to have changed. Because I've dealt with these people many times in the past, because I'm an activist and apparently I'm controversial. But every time that I'd had to deal with them, they'd been totally polite, totally professional, and they'd always exonerated me of anything I was being accused of, because I was being accused by some far-left activist who wasn't really telling the truth. And now it's Patreon themselves who are being the far-left activists who are not really telling the truth.
So you think that the actual nature of the site has changed?
Yes, I think that there's been... I think that the election of Donald Trump has kind of driven the left further along the line of their own thought process, to the point where now you've got Tim Cook saying, like from Apple saying, that it would be sinful not to censor people from these platforms. I think that's a form of radicalization that we're seeing because of the election of Donald Trump, and the impending potential re-election of Donald Trump is, frankly, I think, getting under their skin. And I think that what they're doing is preemptively removing Trump supporting content creators as and where they can by a kind of malicious application of the rules. Because, I mean, if you look on Patreon's website, the N-word is all over that website. I did a search the other day, there were more than 9 pages worth of pages with that word on it. So I don't think that Patreon actually have too much of a problem with that word itself. And obviously context matters if that's the case. So I think that really this was just because I personally oppose political correctness. And the other people who are deplatformed are all people who also oppose political correctness. And I think that that's what we're seeing here. There are many, I guess we would call them communist accounts, very far left, often openly revolutionary, openly hostile. Some of them very big gun advocates who will say things like, paying me $5 a month puts another bullet in the chamber and stuff like this, shooting the capitalists and the corporations and things. So, it's not that there isn't revolutionary communist material that is at least backed by the threat of violence on their site, but I guess that because it's on the left, and I don't consider myself to be on the left, they take issue. They don't take issue with them, but they do take issue with me.
I mean, Patreon are a private company. Surely they're allowed to decide who's allowed on their platform or not.
Strange. Everyone becomes a libertarian all of a sudden because it's such an easy argument to default to, isn't it? It's like, well, they're a private company. It's like, well, private companies have rules and regulations, just like the rest of, but even like publicly owned corporations, even like independent sole traders like myself. Everyone's regulated in some way, and I think that there's no point having a terms and conditions on your website if you're not going to follow it. If you're just going to take arbitrary action against it, even if it was legal to do, and I don't know that it is, because these are contracts that you enter into. And I haven't spoken to a lawyer about this, but I am aware of that. Even if that's the case, I don't think it's wise for your own brand to let people know that your enforcers on your website don't actually care what the rules are, and they'll just act in an arbitrary and capricious manner if they feel like it. I mean, they've seen a massive reduction in patron pledges following this, hundreds of thousands, because it seemed unjust. And the thing is, as well, as Jack Conte himself said, when he was having his interview with Dave Rubin and in a video that he did, he's very, very well aware of the magnitude of taking someone's income away from them. And he considers that a prime and enormous responsibility to bear. And yet, here we are, where they're now doing it arbitrarily, even though, for example, like Milo Yiannopoulos, it doesn't really matter what you think about Milo. What matters is what's true and what's not, and whether the procedure are being followed. Milo's apparent association, quote unquote, with the Proud Boys was the reason that he was deplatformed from the site. Well, what's wrong with the Proud Boys? The Patreon said there was some sort of violent extremist group, but the FBI came out and said, no, they're not. They're not a violent extremist group. So do Patreon now have to reverse their decision? Or is this, again, another arbitrary decision that's just going to be taken just to hurt a content creator who's an active opponent of political correctness and this kind of Bay Area, Silicon Valley culture? Because honestly, it's really hard to argue that that's not what this is. It's political. It's not moral, and it's not factual even. And the point is that the noose has been tightening. First they get rid of the very fringe, and now we're down to centrist edgelords on the internet.
And yeah, we're testing to see what the boundaries are. We're a business. We made the decision to fund ourselves primarily through Patreon. We are now in a position where we don't know what the rules are with Patreon. We know they have specifically said that they are not following their own terms of service. Jack Conte was on the Dave Rubin report, and he said specifically that it was only what you did on Patreon. Sargon was not on Patreon, so they've already broken that rule of service. And in some of the emails that they've sent out to people, they've said, we make our decisions on a one-to-one basis based on, we have an individual relationship with each of our creators. That's not really good enough, because you have to know what the principles are, you have to know what the rules are. You can't make a decision as a business when you know that your main source of income could be taken away from you at any time.
Yeah. I think it's also worth noting just our experience over the last week. We went on Subscribestar and spent quite a lot of time cloning our Patreon page and putting it on Subscribestar, and days later PayPal pulled their processing from all of Subscribestar, which was fascinating and sucked as well. But it was indicative of a wider problem than just Patreon. PayPal as a payment provider has also been involved in this. So it's a complex matter, because that raises a whole host of other questions around what their terms of service are, or where the justification is with them.
It's also interesting to look at why this is happening, because it seems that a lot of the tech companies made a decision that to be able to hire millennials, be able to hire kind of the younger folks coming out of university now, what they want is a company that shares their values. So they very deliberately created a company that shares their values. You don't have to leave your values at home, you can bring your values to work, we're inclusive, we're ethical, and what they haven't realized, I think, until now, is that that has huge impacts, because you're starting to make these values the core of your business rather than the job of your business.
Yeah, and I think the phrase that comes to mind, which I've seen in lots of comments, is get woke, go broke. And I think it's a pithy phrase, but I think it speaks to exactly what you're talking about. There is a contradiction in value systems between a capitalist business and the ideology of extreme relativity and postmodernism and PC culture. I think the Patreon example is a perfect example of that. I don't know what Patreon's numbers are. I have no idea how big the hit has been for them. I know how big the hit has been for us. And for other people, I suppose, in the wider sphere of the intellectual dark web, etc. But I'd be very curious to see that, and I'd be very curious to know what conversations happen behind closed doors in that, because I do think there is a clash of cultures, because the safety and the trust and safety team is led by a woman who's very experienced e-commerce marketing person. Like Sargon did a good video where he kind of went on her LinkedIn and you see her experience. But looking at the video that Patreon released, I think on Patrons Day, a lot of the staff are much younger than that. And I don't know, but I suspect that the trust and safety team is staffed by a much younger crowd who have a very different ideology. So it'll be fascinating to see how this plays out, not just with them, but with other tech companies.
And I also want to say, because this is where this gets very difficult, because, and this is a point that I made with Benjamin Boyce recently, we did an interview about this. It's not that the values are wrong, and this is the key point, that there's a lot of people, it's not uncommon to see a lot of people saying, well, this new SJW culture is a religion, there's a lot of antagonism towards it. And the complexity that needs to be held, it's not that these values are wrong, there's nothing wrong with inclusivity, there's nothing wrong with diversity, but if you make them your primary axioms, if you make them your primary values, as opposed to truth, as opposed to the dignity of the individual, for example, then a good way of saying it is if you make care rather than truth your primary value, then by definition you're going to have to build a wall to keep out the people that you think are not aligned with that ideology.
There's another thing that I think there's a deeper problem to it as well, whereas the values might be and are often noble, trying to make something, Alan Watts used to talk about this a lot, trying to make something come about that only means something when it comes spontaneously, and trying to make that come about through force is a complete paradox. It's like telling someone, you have to love me, but it's only real if you really want to love me, and that's what you have to do. It doesn't work. So trying to enforce diversity, trying to enforce inclusion, trying to enforce anything is doomed to fail. It has to come from a deeper, I suppose, axiomatic place than that.
So Sargon put out a video very soon afterwards saying you cannot trust Patreon, and I thought it was really, really well put together, because considering he just lost a lot of his livelihood, it was really forensic and it was very measured, and it also included a couple of really important pieces. I'm going to play a short clip from Tim Cook, the head of Apple, because I think this is really interesting. This really shows what I think a lot of the tech companies are now thinking.
Because our own dignity moves us to see the dignity in others. Perhaps most importantly, it drives us not to be bystanders as hate tries to make its headquarters in the digital world. At Apple, we believe that technology needs to have a clear point of view on this challenge. There is no time to get tied up in knots. That's why we only have one message for those who seek to push hate, division, and violence. You have no place on our platforms. You have no home here. Technology should be about human potential. It should be about optimism. And we believe the future should belong to those who use technology to build a better, more inclusive, and more hopeful world. After all, history is full of examples of what can happen when those with power and those who ought to have good judgment instead look the other way. I believe the most sacred thing that each of us is given is our judgment, our morality, our own innate desire to separate right from wrong. Choosing to set that responsibility aside at a moment of trial is a sin. We as individuals have the power to know and feel and act, and we ought to use it.
In some sense, I agree with some of the words, like I agree with some of the sentiments that Tim Cook is saying. I do think we all need to exercise our judgment, but in this context, it looks really chilling to me, and also very sanctimonious. I don't get a vibe from Tim Cook that I would trust him to be in this position, and this is really, really worrying, because I don't think the people in charge of these tech companies have the sophistication. We've talked a lot about on this channel about this kind of the liberal shadow, and the liberal shadow, which is this sense of innate moral superiority, where we're so inclusive, we're so good, unlike those other people. And that's the shadow. That is the shadow. It's always projecting the bad people are over there. There's no self-awareness, there's no self-knowledge, there's no wisdom in that. And this is what's really terrifying, I think, of the people who have this power and the way that they're likely to use it. Yeah. There is a quality in the way that he's delivering it that it's the true believer. It's that kind of messianic sense of, I know what's best for you.
What I find chilling about the Tim Cook talk is that there's a religiosity to it, and there's also a huge conflict of interest with a tech company whose main motive is to make profit for its shareholders, having that kind of very distinct religious mission, in a sense, because usually it goes that religions form and then they become profit-based when they kind of decline. And this almost feels like the other way around. It doesn't seem to, it's already starting off at the wrong foot. So there's been a lot of tension actually all year. I think it's part of a wider story. For example, Facebook coming under so much fire for trying to maintain that they're a neutral platform and then having to backpedal quite heavily because of the Trump election, because of extremism and hate speech, etc. And now, well, yeah, I mean, the Tim Cook thing is indicative of some kind of new strategy, but that strategy could well be worse than what happened before.
So yeah, what happens now? It's still possible that Patreon will have some kind of realization. I'm sure this has been a pretty bruising experience for them. They will have lost they've lost a lot of creators. I'm sure they've lost a lot of patrons. And I mean, the disappointing thing is that every statement that I've seen them put out, there doesn't seem to be any real self-reflection in it. They seem to be doubling down and doubling down and doubling down. And unless they can come out and say, well, yeah, maybe we overstepped, you can make a case because of the language that Sargon used. It was certainly uncautious, and it was certainly, but not to have any warning, not to have any kind of obvious course of appeal or even real response to his emails, from what I can understand from him. That's pretty terrifying. So I emailed the press office at Patreon yesterday and asked if someone would be available for an interview. They haven't responded. Just then is what's called in the news business empty chairing someone, which is what most companies and government departments really want to avoid, being empty chaired. It's a journalist's way of saying to the viewers, well, you make up your mind. We asked them, but they said no one was available or they didn't respond. But it's important that we reflect Patreon's position, so I'm going to reflect that using the latest statement that they have.
Sargon used racial slurs to insult others and specifically linked those slurs with negative generalizations of behavior, in contrast to how people of other races act. He also used a slur related to sexual orientation to generally insult others. Taken in whole, with all of the context, this violates our community guidelines. Patreon does not and will not condone hate speech in any of its forms. We stand by our policies against hate speech. We believe it's essential for Patreon to have strong policies against hate speech to build a safe community for our creators and their patrons.
And also, Patreon, if you're watching this and you do want to come on and put your side of the picture, more than happy to interview you, as I'm sure Dave Rubin and many others would be as well. So we're going to close our Patreon account at the end of January unless something drastic changes with Patreon. We'll probably lose some patrons because it's a time and attention cost for people to change, but I don't really see an alternative to, Patreon I don't think can be trusted, and there's no way that we could be making content about the kind of difficult subjects that we want to make content about and have this thing in the back of our minds thinking, where's the line and what happens if some activists come after us because of some of the content we put out? How do we trust Patreon? So we have already set up a subscription on our website. I'll put the link below this film. And we're going to be looking carefully at what Jordan Peterson and Dave Rubin are putting together. And we'll almost certainly sign up with their subscription service as well and diversify as much as we can. And of course, the whole point of this in the first place, firstly, we have loads of extra content for subscribers, and we also have good direct relationships with all of our high-value patrons. The one-to-one calls are fantastic. We rely on those and our relationships with them for ideas and connections, and it's really, really important. So that's the key to us. The platform's not that important, but the relationships that we have with the patrons are really important. So if you enjoyed this, check out maybe joining the Rebel Wisdom Club or the Rebel Wisdom community, and see you soon.